Eyes on Longmont, offering a diversity of topics about our community that will inform and entertain you. We invite you to sit back and enjoy this edition of Eyes on Longmont.
Hello everyone, my name is Marco Montanari and I want to welcome you to my studio. I am a wax painter and I wanted you to come in and investigate what I'm doing today.
Hi, I'm Mark Rossier. I'm a potter in Niwot and I'm here with my good friend Marco Montanari, who is a wax painter, and we're in his studio right now in the Hoi Polloi workshops in North Boulder in the Nobo Art District. And this area here in the Nobo Art District has a whole growing collection of artist studios. Hoi Polloi Workshops has some art studios and a sort of a community ceramic studio as well. And there are more artists moving in here all the time. And today we're just going to talk a little bit about process, what Marco does, and what it's like to be an artist. So I guess the first question I have for you is why wax? I mean, I think it's really interesting why artists choose the medium that they work in. And wax is sort of an unusual medium to decide to paint in. Mm-hmm. So how did that come about?
Before I answer your question, Mark, I want to thank you for being part of this interview. You really appreciate it. Mark and I have been great friends for over 10 years, and Mark is a wonderful ceramic artist in his own right, and he has a beautiful studio in Niwot. So as far as your question is concerned, how did I get started in all of this? Well, it goes back quite a ways when I was very young, like 5 years old, starting with my mother making Christmas candles, and I was part of that, and grew this fascination with the wax and candles and the idea that I can take something inanimate and bring it to life by striking a match to a candle. That was really amazing to me, and it started the love of being with wax. In my adult life, I started doing sculpting with wax. I would make these giant cylinders of wax and literally sculpt them on a wood lathe. And then I came up with a process of painting the wax with paraffin and pigments. And while they're melted, I would paint the surface of these sculptures and polish them down, and they would become large, beautiful candles that you could just keep reusing and reusing. About 18 years ago, I discovered this wax painting process called Encaustic. And I started looking into it. And that was my next love, because I was able to take that work that I was doing on these sculptures and put it onto boards and actually start painting with it. Now the term encaustic, it is an ancient form of painting, about 2,000 to 3,000 years old. And its origin is beeswax that has pigment coloring added to it while it's melted. And while it's melted, you move it rather quickly onto your surface that you're going to be painting on. Mostly it's rigid boards. The term encaustic comes from burn in, caustic burn in. And what that means is that when you layer a piece of beeswax, one on top of the other, they don't quite fuse together. So there's a what they call a burn-in process, where today they use torches or heat guns. You soften the top layer, it then will molecularly bond to the layer below. Add another layer, you do the same thing, on top, on top, on top. When I first started working with Encaustic, I found that process a little cumbersome for what I was used to with using paraffins. And so because I had been working with paraffins for so long, I had developed a type of wax that will stick to itself when I was painting these sculpted candles. And I just worked with that instead of beeswax on my paintings. And that process of not having to burn in allowed me to do some more creative process with my paintings in this form of build-up and etching and carving and things along that line. Both processes are wonderful. Traditional encaustic is amazing, and I personally enjoy working with the paraffins and the process that I've kind of developed. And we can take a look at those later on. So that's sort of the long history of what got me to my process today, and what I've been doing for probably the last 18 years, working with this formula paraffin that I developed and doing wax painting.
What I find really fascinating about your work, you still consider yourself a painter, but they're very sculptural, they're very three-dimensional. And you are layering and then cutting back through. So can you talk a little bit about that? You can see some of the pieces around here, and just how you're taking the wax, but it doesn't, the end product doesn't necessarily look like wax. It looks like all sorts of other materials, which I think is really fascinating. So can you talk a little bit more about how you came up with that? I mean, how do you, because I know that it's taken a lot of experimenting for you to come up with your process.
Mm-hmm. Well, part of the formula of the paraffin that I came up with that allows it to stick to itself, I don't have any concerns about layering and layering and layering and building up and building up and building up. And I can get it built up enough to the point that I'm able to carve into it. And so I have that three-dimensionality to it. I may etch into things. I may just create a surface that has a lot of texture to it by building it up. So much of it was experimenting and or a mistake that happened to turn out, and I went, oh wow, look what happened here. And so then I played with that and add that to my repertoire. So it is a constantly evolving process. One of the things that I wound up doing on a number of my pieces is I will actually paint on watercolor paper. So I layer and layer and layer, and then I polish down the wax to a very, very thin glaze, and I'm able to cut the paper up and weave it. And I'll put that on a board, and it has this weaving with the wax painting on top of it, and then I can paint on it and over it and around it. So that was kind of a fun, it just sort of happened. I think I was testing colors on paper and somehow polished it down and went, oh, wow, look what I could do with this. So, you know, these things just pop. And as I'm sure you go through, and all artists, mistakes can be a haven for creating new wondrous avenues.
I find that a lot, actually, that there'll be something, even just a very small part of a piece, something that I didn't expect, and I'll zero in on that and say, oh, I want to try to make that happen now.
Yeah.
I think that's a fascinating part of the process in being an artist. Is the way I describe it is I'm always chasing after something that you're really tuning in to really subtle things about the work that you're doing. And some part of that, some small part, may really take you off in a whole nother direction.
Yeah, I know. And now, you know, new pieces are exploiting that
Yes.
to a maximum level, you know, until one screws up and something else comes out of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that part of the process. I mean, that's one of the things that keeps me going.
Yeah,
That
yeah,
you feel like
exactly.
you're never done. There's always something else that
Yes.
really takes your interest.
Yeah, and that's one of the things you said, you know, that I have a lot of variations with the wax. The medium itself allows that to happen, and I don't find that in a lot of other mediums with paint. Now, different types of painting, that you can get this dimension out of it that is always, like I said, surprising me in one way or another. So I just have a lot of fun with it. It's really creative.
Yeah, it's interesting because I do think of the both of us as being three-dimensional kind of people, and I think it's very interesting that you consider yourself a painter, and I, you know, you're sort of in the two-dimensional realm, and I'm in the three-dimensional realm, making pottery. But really, we have a lot in common with the way that we work and the processes that we do and how we work with our materials. So I think that's sort of a fascinating thing.
And we both make great messes.
And we make great messes.
You know, which is
right. That's another thing we're really good at.
Yeah,
making messes.
Wearing our art home.
Yeah, it's true. It's very true.
At times.
Yeah. So I'm always so curious about these shields, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, well, in part about the process. You have a miniature here. But then we can go around and talk about some of the shields and what they're about, and a little bit about where the ideas come from too.
Well, the idea was a long evolved one in that not unusual, I'm sure, with a lot of artists, had a little crisis about my art. And about 5 years ago or so, I had this thing where I felt like I was missing a component of myself, my soul, going into my work. I was painting, but the connection between the painting and what was sort of in my heart and my soul wasn't quite there. So I literally stopped painting for about a year and really kind of investigated, what does that mean? What's going on? Why don't I have this? Am I worthy? So I was journaling and doing a lot of sketching, and about 5-6 years ago I was in Atlanta, and my wife and I were in the botanical gardens that had a show of Henry Moore, who was an English sculptor, and they had his sculptures around the botanical gardens. And they were huge pieces, and about 95% of them were all women figures. But he had a small series of what was called the ancient warriors. And I'm walking through this botanical garden, and I come across this little setting, and there is this ancient, like, Greek warrior that's wounded and had fallen back and was just being held up and supported by his shield. And I just had this boom, overwhelming epiphany. And I sat down. I always carried a little sketch book with me, and I started sketching and drawing and putting down thoughts. And what I saw in that shield was that the shield was a support. And not only that, support was an essence of that warrior spirit that is embodied in that warrior. And I looked at the shield and saw all of that in there, that these shields are part of all of us. We all have a piece of what I call the warrior spirit. And that shield is our emblem of who we are in that spirit, our protector, our showing our scars in life, our breakthrough moments, just how it changes us, and how it's represented in that shield, in that warrior spirit within. So I came back and I started working a process. How do I get this on a painting? And the first thing I did was play around with materials, and I came up with this plywood that's a bendable plywood and a framework behind it. So I cut the shape, attach it to this framework, and you can see the shields here, they're all scarred. So that was one of the things I would do. That's part of the fun, was to beat the hell out of the shield here before I started painting. So I would have an idea, a concept for everything. What am I trying to evoke? I didn't want to have absolutes on this, because I want everybody to kind of look at this and see, how does that come to them? What part of that individual warrior spirit may touch them in it? So evoking symbols and concepts that I hopefully got across on some of these pieces.
Well, I know you've told me stories about people coming in and seeing your shields in the studio and being moved to tears because they connect with something about what that's expressing to them personally.
Yeah.
And that, you can't ask for anything better than that.
Yeah.
Because then it seems to me you're really communicating. I tend to think of the work that I do as a kind of a language, and it sounds like it. That's
a
like
very
that
good.
too, that you're actually communicating with other people in a totally different language, but there's an understanding there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's really wonderful.
Yeah.
That.
And an unspoken language speaks volumes
Yes.
more than trying to sit there and articulate it to somebody.
Yeah.
And so that was doing these shields, and you can see I did quite a large series of them, connected me to that, to my own personal spirit and the work that I do on my canvases. And now when I come to my work table and start a piece, I feel like I'm starting at that level, that I'm starting somewhere where there's a connection. And to me, it has elevated my work, at least personally. I feel much more bonded to the work. And so I always try to start at that point. And so it was a wonderful journey. Amazing to have that epiphany and that work.
Well, let's go around and talk about some of these. I mean, maybe we should just start right here with this one that's been behind us.
So part of the work that I do is, as I said, I'm trying to evoke, not necessarily outline exactly what this is supposed to be. The warrior and our personal lives go through a lot of battles. And the idea here is that this is heavily scarred, that has gone through some very rough times, that is dark, but you have this breakthrough moment. And I don't know if you can see it, but it's sort of a blue sky, and there's this angelic wing in the middle of it. And again, how transformation happens in sometimes the most adverse conditions that you have. And that was what this piece was about. I have I don't know if you can see up top here, this is a heart. This was a crazy one to do. I have probably hundreds of layers on this in order to carve that three-dimensional heart out of it. The idea there is we always talk about our heart being broken or torn apart or anything along that line. And again, this soul connection that I have, that's more of our ego talking than what our heart is really about. We can't hurt our heart. We can hurt our ego. And that the heart, at the heart of the heart, is a binding that holds it together no matter what. And that is you see the cross-hashing that is the weave that holds it together. So what is happening with this weave is one of the fun little almost mistakes that happened is I was testing coloring on paper, on watercolor paper, and for some reason I polished it down and realized, wow, this is great. I have this paper. And I started cutting it up and weaving it. And so that's what that is. It's actually watercolor paper that I had painted with wax, polished down, cut up and wove. And I've done that on a number of pieces, and it just adds a real interesting flavor to the piece. So that is my torn to the fabric heart. This one is a unique piece because it's not the bendable plywood, it's concentric rings of plywood that I glued and secured together and then sanded for days to get that. That was one of the first pieces I did, and I labeled it the Warrior of Light. And it just, to me, is a classic shield that showed the heart and real spirit and light of a warrior.
I'm curious about this one.
This
one
one
is very different than the other ones, particularly
Yeah.
because it has a lot of writing on it. But yeah, talk about that.
I have a very good friend of mine who lives in Saratoga, New York, who is a poet. Her name's Elaine Hanley. And about 4 years ago, when I was doing the Warrior Shields, she was doing a series of poetry on veterans and soldiers. And we realized that we had something in common, and we decided to try to collaborate. And we did a show where she wrote to 8 of my paintings, and I painted to 8 of her poems. It's an ancient form of art called ekphrastic, where started, again, thousands of years ago, where they would write about artwork. Individuals would write about artwork. And mostly it started out about really explaining the art for those that couldn't get to it. But as art became more available, and especially photography, that writing freed them up a little bit more to get more expressive, and it turned more into poetry and essence of what the artwork is. This piece here was inspired by a poem she calls Christmas Eve at the Vietnam Memorial. And I won't read the whole poem, but it's her visiting the Vietnam Memorial. She was actually there at the dedication and seeing people going up and reading the names and just the heartache that went on at this memorial, how impacting it was. The painting that I did was a shield that mirrored the memorial's black marble surface, and I etched in and carved, instead of names, I decided to use what I call in fond remembrances of. So everything starts with my someone, my mother, my mentor, my father, my champion. And the idea is what was the term of endearment that you gave to these individuals that you've lost in life? So that was a wonderful piece at the show, and we had set a little table up with a journal, and we asked people to write in their endearments. So at the end of the show, we had this whole list of, these endearment. Yeah,
that's wonderful, because then you're also bringing the public into the process.
Yeah.
And to think about, again, going back to the idea of language, thinking about how we just how we talk to each other, or how we think about each other and express emotions to each other by those little endearments.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to read. To just look at them all. They range from just my son or my mom. They get more connected. My sympathizer. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
It's a really wonderful piece. Yeah.
Thanks.
How
So
about, let's see, I'm really kind of curious too about some of these, like this one with the wings here too.
Yeah.
Let's see if you can see those.
So this piece here, again, that probably has about 50, 60 layers of wax. So I just layer and layer and layer, and then I started carving. I went for these black wings because it's not something that's dark or evil. In mythology, the black wings represent imperfection, not evil. And it's the imperfection that the angelic being has as they go through trying to reach perfection, that journey to be there. And that was what I was. That was my outline for this particular piece. Yeah.
Yeah, it has the feel almost of like an old tombstone. You know, some of those images that you see on very old tombstones. Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yes.
Do you want to talk a little bit about your actually how you work with your brushes and your wax then? So show us a little bit of, specifically about how you work on the wood and your brushes and your whole palette setup over there.
Yeah. So this is my work surface. It's a drafting table that I modified. And this is my canvas. My canvas is always on plywood. Mm-hmm. And I use what's called CDX, which is a rough plywood, because the nice thing about it is the first layer of wax is absorbed by the fibers. This is my palette here. I have a crock pot that I put the clear paraffin wax or opaque paraffin wax in, and I pour blocks of that formulated paraffin that I told you about, and then I just drop it into here, and that gives me the base. The base is then, I take a scoop of it, pour it into here, and these here are my pigments. These I purchase, and they are a very high density pigment in wax. And then what I can do is I can just shave the coloring into my yes.
You could
my paraffin,
right?
And I can shave it into the density that I want it to be, as well as I can shave other colors and mix and match. So it becomes a really typical palette in that I can blend things around in here. Now, when I'm painting,
well, before you talk about that, also just the structure of your palette. So what you have, these are off-the-shelf things that you have, but you also have brushes you've made yourself, right?
Yes. So typical Encaustic uses just regular paint brushes of different types. And what I found was that the problem with a regular paintbrush is that it cools very quickly. As you can imagine, wax, when you dripped a candle onto a surface, immediately it freezes. So I came up with these metal brushes, which are what's called a flux brush. And flux brushes, if you've done any plumbing, are used to put this material called flux around your pipe before you solder, and it helps move the solder around. The nice thing about them, if you get the right brushes, type of flux brushes, is that they're metal. They're a metal case. And the interesting thing is that I found that by using these, I get heat transfer up the metal shaft, and it holds the wax liquid just a little bit more. Now they're kind of clunky, so I don't use them for fine detail, but they are great for doing big surfaces. And boom. When I get to fine detail, then I will go back to some of the finer brushes that are a typical paintbrush. But you've got to move very quickly with those. So even with this, you're moving quickly. So depending upon what the painting is going to be, and if I have a concept of what it is, then I will set my palette with the various color tones that I'm trying to get. And then, as I said, I can brush. Now, one of the fun things about wax and why I like it so much is, I don't know if you can pick this up, but the surface dries so quickly that I'm getting texture right on it. And so that's something that you can play with. You can build up the texture and you can weave colors on top of colors. And then by doing that, what's happening is these tones, these color variations are filling in the highs and the lows of the paintbrush that you laid in just before it. And then by, as I said, doing various texture tones and playing around with this, you can then create an interesting pattern once it cools down by then taking these scraping tools that I have and going over this, and what happens is you start pulling color tones from below. And this is a very quick demonstration, but you can see those different layers are kind of coming through, and that's what I use on a lot of my pieces. I play around with it, and I can get things like faux marbled or stone or sky techniques or just improvise all along. The tools that I use, interestingly enough, are, and Mark will know, these are sculpting tools, a lot of them.
These are pottery tools.
Pottery tools, rather, yeah, pottery tools. So I literally buy tools that are pottery tools. I buy all sorts of stuff. And you can see I have gouges and scrapers, and I even get crazy with wire brushes to get textures.
That's a pottery tool.
Heavy graded there.
Yeah.
So it just opens things up all over the place. This piece here is, I'm not sure if we talked about it or not, but how do you set up a painting that you're going to be doing?
Right, because since you're working with so many layers, you have to think about where you're starting and where you're ending up. Basically.
Exactly.
Right.
Yes. Now, as I know that you do, sometimes you come to a piece and you go exactly what you're doing. You can lay it out, you can draw it out and everything, and you go right to it. Other times you have an idea and just a vague concept. And so that's what I play with here. Regardless, there's still a process of how you have to work with pieces. And so this one here, I layered this, what is going to be sort of a moonscape look to it. And that was layered on first, and then I build up and over it. And part of the process will, as I'm building up and over this, when I'm polishing down or scraping down, that initial buildup of this moonscape here is going to pop through. If I do something that I look at and go, boy, this didn't work at all. For example, this. I can also take my scraping tool and clear it away.
That's, to me, that's an important part of process as well. And that distinction of when in the process you can backtrack, you can erase,
yes,
or get rid of things you don't like, and when you can't, and being very clear about where that happens. Because mostly, it seems to me that because you're working with that kind of layering process and then taking away, carving away, you can change things and correct things to a degree, but you can get to a point where you do have to just start over again.
Yeah.
And that's, you sort of want to avoid those, at least I do.
Yes, yeah. Well, one of the interesting things, though, with the wax is that I can really micro-manage a section that is not working the way I want it to be. So I can scrape it away and I can blend. There's a lot of things that you can do once the wax is on the board. It dries very quickly and you're stuck that way. And one of the maybe downsides of the wax painting is blending. It's very difficult to blend. with other paints, you can put paints on your canvas surface, and then because it's still viscous and wet, or you can blend them together. This dries so fast, you get this very distinct variation between the tones. And if you look at some of the paintings and you get up close, you can see those distinct moments. But once it's on the board, you can add some heat to it and try to blend it out a little bit if you'd like to. And that process lends itself to, I mean, the work that you can do once it's on the board allows you to rework a lot of things that you might find difficult. So you could take out a small corner and blend it back in and work it that way. Of course, I never have to do that. Everything just, oh, well, right, you're the same way. You no waste.
No waste.
Whatsoever. This gives you just a little idea of how this goes on. It's really a lot of fun. I do teach some workshops, and I try to get people to the point where they finish an actual painting that we frame and get home. And it's just an enjoyable medium to play with and build and rework and
yeah, that's something you and I both do. We do some teaching, and we've both done some residencies and things like that. And
yeah.
So this is it is nice. It's a process that you can at least let people actually participate in a little bit. The same is true with pottery, so that they get a sense of what the process is like. And part of what I like about that is that they also get a sense of how difficult the process is.
Yeah.
Which is sort of important. It's you can, when you watch somebody that has spent a long time working very hard at the techniques that they use, and when other people watch you do it, and I know you and I both have been on studio tours, people come through and watch you working. It looks easy.
Yes.
And people think, wow, that's pretty easy, but it's really not. It's really not.
I know. I know one of my favorite lines is, "How long did it take you to make this piece?"
Yes.
And I always say, "Oh, about 35 years, 7 months, and 6 weeks."
Yeah. It's very true.
Yeah.
That process never stops.
No. But the other fun part about it is, even though there is the difficulty and the minutia of it, is watching people have their little aha moments where things do come together for them, maybe in a very basic, simple way, and you just kind of love that they walk away with a piece of artwork that they made, and they're happy to hang on their wall,
right?
Or fire and put on their shelf,
right?
and show off. So anyhow, this is the basic rundown of it. Looks a little complicated, and it can get very messy.
Yeah.
But that's part of the fun of it. If you can't get messy doing your art,
yeah, what fun is it, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And so maybe we can show you some other pieces that kind of show you what some of the various techniques are and what happens with them in the painting. And the one thing I'll show you is, I talked a little bit about what happens when I take watercolor paper and paint on it. And the process that you saw here of layering and then scraping down is what I do on this paper. So I get it to the point where it's a very, very thin glaze on the paper, and different designs and outline, color variations that you can play with. And then I'm able to cut it up and weave it. And once I have it woven like this, then I glue it down to the surface, and then I can paint over it and around it and on top of it. And I think we showed you that heart piece that had that.
That's very interesting, because then that's if you think about it, that's a very different process to actually be creating the material that you're working with, as opposed to just painting with the
Yeah.
medium. So that's two, it would seem to me, two very different processes.
It is, and in the weave, a lot of times I want to have some movement in the weave, so you have to really lay that out. How is that you're cutting this and weaving it and creating that flow within it? Now, one of the other interesting things is here I have paper in this weave, and I don't know if you can catch this piece behind me, but that weave is then carved. So that's a different process, layer, 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 and then I hand carved what I hope looked like a weave into it. So you can just again that myriad of variations that you can get with it. One of the process that I do with this is I will paint something on another board, or I use a piece of wax paper, and I will do a carving out of it or something that I want and create an image, and then I take that and move that onto a board, and again paint and work around. And Mark, if you want to grab that heart piece there. So this piece kind of gives an idea of a number of the processes that I can do on it. There's a weave behind there. I don't know if you can get into it enough, but again, that's a weave using this gold paper that I made. The heart I actually painted on a separate board, or actually it was a piece of, I taped down a piece of wax paper. I layer, 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 carved the heart out, was able to peel it from the wax paper, glued it down onto the board here, and then I did the painting around this. And this is all wax. And again, building it up enough to hand carve it into what looks like the folds and the tears and everything that goes. So fun stuff with the wax. I mean, it just, you know, you can just go with it and go with it and go with it. Etching into the wax. If I make a very smooth surface, I can then take an etching tool and etch into it, and I'll do an ink wash over the surface, polish away the ink, and I have this little kind of pen drawing like that you can put into it. Wax can be very difficult to get very fine definition at times. So doing the etching process over the painting kind of allows you to bring in some real fine details back into it.
Now, and this brings up another question I have too. We don't think of wax as something that is durable and will last a long time. And I know you've worked with your process some to figure out how to give it a permanence as well. So how do you, once you've done all that work, how well does a wax, a piece of yours, a wax piece of yours, hold up over time?
Well, that's a very good point, because that comes up a lot. I do tell people that every one of my pieces, I have a disclaimer on the back that says, never ever hang this in your oven. So
bad idea.
Yeah, bad idea. But other than that, part of the formula that I put in there, I try to make the wax a fairly high melting temperature wax that's out there, and also put in some stabilizers to keep the wax hardened and everything. What I tell people is, don't put it in direct sunlight. So if you're going to hang this somewhere in your house, somewhere in direct sunlight, or no sunlight at all. So that's basically it. And a lot of fine art, they just tell you the same thing. Don't put it, because the sun is going to be very harsh on anything that way. So otherwise, it's extremely durable and holds up quite well.
All right.
We're going to take a little tour around here with some of the paintings.
Tell us a little about this particular series here, this the Contrary Moon that you have.
Yeah, I did an original painting a few years ago, and I was exploring again. The concept just came up about, and I can't even remember where it was. This idea about a contrary moon, and the contrariness that's within and without us. Not that it's good or bad, but that we just have these this going on within ourselves. Mm-hmm. So I did a painting, and my poet friend Elaine Hanley did a poem that she titled Contrary Moon. And I decided, just again, one of those things where if I have this concept idea, I want to explore it a little deeper. So I've been doing this kind of series and going, expanding on this idea of the contrary moon. And this one here is, I just finished last week, almost finished, and I'll explain in a second. This piece I just finished. One of the things that Elaine and I decided to do to expand our collaboration is I'm now taking moments of her poems and actually incorporating them into the piece. So this one is from her poem, A Contrary Moon, and it might be very difficult for you to read this, but it is lines in her poem that says, "Let the moon tumble in its wanton way, it cycles what we are made of, the alchemy of light and dark." She sent me another poem here called Snowdrift, and I took some of her lines and put them in here, and this one says, "And we will walk tenderly on ice while the winter repairs the world. Do you listen to the quiet, raw music of snow?" So it's kind of a fun thing. Now, one of the challenges I have is I don't want these things to look like a Hallmark card. So it's how do I integrate words onto the piece. And while I was telling you this is not quite done, this is a painting that I got to this point and sent the image to Elaine, and she's working on a poem for it. Oh, and then I will take part of that and work that into the painting. So this is here in limbo, waiting for Elaine to do her magic.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And then these, how about some of these up here?
Well, one of the other things, I talked about how I do images on a separate board and then peel them off. That's how these pieces are done. So I did these little moments on a separate board, shaped them, peeled them off, and then created this mosaic. And everything else around it is painted on the board, and the different textures and everything done. This one here was kind of a fun piece because I had to really, really work it in layers on top of layers on top of layers. And the very base of it was these blue rectangles, these marbleized rectangles. So that was the first thing. And then the silver was laid onto it, and then the outside. All of that kind of overlaps one another, and if I do it in the right layers, I can carve it back. So I could carve out the rectangles and clean them up, carve out the blocks that were silvered, and then left all the other work around it. This piece here is a small series that you can see. I kind of pulled some of it down here. It was just playing with trying to blend the work as finely detailed as possible. But this gives you an idea how difficult it can be to try to blend when your paint medium freezes immediately. Mm-hmm. You just can't take your brush and blend things around, but you still get a wonderful effect. It's a lot of interesting stuff that goes on there that as you step away from the piece, it blends more and more.
That's what I was noticing. If you look at it up close, you see a lot of, you see the texture and you see the layers, but as you back away from it, it looks more like it's a blended piece.
Yeah.
It's fascinating that way. So one of the parts we haven't really talked about at all is, for any artist, it's all well and good to be producing these things, but if no one sees them, it kind of is pointless, really. So where can people see your work? Besides, they can come here to your studio.
Yeah. Yes.
So how else do you, how are you showing your work right now? And I know we talk about that a lot. It's a constantly evolving thing. But at the moment, where can people see your work?
Well, there's a number of venues around town that I will be a part of, and shows. And so you can look around Boulder and the surrounding areas. Those are more just exhibitions. Right now, I also have representation in a gallery down in Santa Fe, and there's a wonderful place there called the Encaustic Art Institute in Santa Fe, and it's one of the only galleries that's dedicated strictly to encaustic or wax painting. And I'm going to be doing some workshops there later in the year. And they have a gallery that I'm in there. It's been a little weak. I'm trying to move out now to get my work better represented outside of the area. So
yeah, that's
a process.
As we talk about. That's a lot of what we talk about.
It is. It's not. It's putting on that hat that you're really, as an artist, not always comfortable with. So
that self-promoter.
That self-promoter part, yes. And,
yeah. It definitely that's a tricky. It's very tricky, and I find it's a process of education. So having the chance to talk about process and what you do, and that really helps for people to appreciate what goes into your art and what they personally can get out of it. Then I find, so that's a big deal.
It's a big deal. Yeah. And you sort of have more respect for agents that will do that work for you than having to put yourself out on that limb to say, okay, I'm going to promote it. So it's really, and I don't think there is enough education out there for artists to really have them understand what currently is happening, because things have changed dramatically now with social media, and
yes, the whole there's pluses and minuses to that self-promotion. We in very short time, we've taken that for granted, that what artists do is promote themselves and sell their own work. And that's not always the case.
No.
That's a interesting part of the puzzle. But that doesn't do it entirely, because there is a certain credibility that you get too by having a gallery represent you.
Right.
And having somebody else say, yes, this is a person worth looking at. So it takes a supportive community. It really, really does, for people to be able to see what's out there and then appreciate, and then hopefully purchase and want to live with that work.
Yes, exactly. It's a struggle you're going to do with all the way to the end.
Yes. That's never ending.
Yeah,
it is never ending.
So shall we move around a little more? Or?
Yeah, this is a fascinating triptych. I think it really is the way it looks to me. Three pieces that are actually part of a whole, and it looks very different than a lot of the other work we've looked at. So tell us a little bit about this.
Yeah, I do a lot of abstract work and maybe representational, which gives you a glimpse of what the reality of it is. So this was much more specific in what the imagery is. This is a series that I did that was a bit of a, looking at where our politics are happening, where the country has maybe been leaning, and my piece in stating my position on things. And one of the things that I had a lot of fun with this was just really working on creating a three-dimensional image as much as I could with the wax. So there's a lot of buildup of the wax on this, and layering and layering and layering, and then sculpting, excuse me, sculpting into it and creating this dimension on it that as much as you can get on a two-dimensional piece. This one here, actually playing with a figure, which is Icarus, and I went through a lot of variations to get this to work and was really having problems with it. And then I realized that I literally had to, when you talk about layering, what's the steps to it? I had to create the body, the framework of the wings, and then add the clothing on top of it, then add the feathers and everything. So it was literally working with everything. Everything is underneath there. I tried just painting it without doing that, and it just didn't work. It didn't have a reality to it. And this one, again, three-dimensional, trying to get layering of folds, and it was a real interesting piece to put together, this triptych, and make a little statement at the same time.
Well, I think that's something I know we've talked about a lot over the years. We both feel really strongly that artists are agents of social change. That because as an artist we're commenting and mirroring back sort of where our culture is, we actually start to change and influence culture, and that's very important to both of us. And so I think of pieces like this, that's very clear that that's the intent behind it. And it doesn't even particularly matter where you fall politically. I think we could agree now that we're politically struggling. We're trying to figure something out, and that it's very important that as artists we're commenting on that, and ultimately, hopefully, offering a direction or offering a way to look at things, if that's and mirroring back what's going on.
Yeah, I know we've had a lot of discussions on this, and it's all ranges of art, from literature to dance to music to everything that waves the banner, and because it's so visceral, it really does and can have an impact on where we go and how we go. And all throughout history, you can see where art has sort of led that charge for change, one way or another.
Yeah, and again, it might be difficult. The times might be difficult, but it creates incredible pieces of art too. It's not just not in that sort of negative way. I've never particularly liked that idea that good art comes from angst, because I don't think that's really true. Right. But it does. I think it makes people look at themselves more closely and consider what's going on, and then their role in that and what they do. So I'm fascinated by these pieces because of that. I think it's great. I think some of those things have to bubble to the surface.
Yes, sure. And you don't always have to suffer to sing the blues.
That's right.
So.
It's true.
So my location is 4939 North Broadway in Boulder, and this is the Hoi Polloi Workshops, and that's number 57 in the complex here. And open kind of as an artist studio. It can be haphazard, but we do regularly do the Boulder First Friday walks, which is the first Friday of every month, and we're on the tour here, and we'll be doing that this May through October.
And that's in the Nobo Art District.
In the Nobo Art District, yes.
Right.
Yes. Okay. And bringing this to a conclusion here, Mark, I want to thank you again for being a wonderful interviewer here, holding my feet to the fire, and
it's a
friend.
It's a pleasure.
Yes. And I do once again want to state that Mark is a wonderful, wonderful ceramic artist himself. And why don't you give a little bit of where you are located?
Oh, I'm right in Old Town Niwot. My studio is behind my house, and it's easy to find. My website is markrossierpottery.com, and you can even just Google Niwot Potter, and you'll find me. So I'm easy to track down.
And I do want to give a thanks out to Channel 8 in Longmont.
Absolutely.
And the wonderful work that is behind the scenes with Preston and Keith. They, I really appreciate them.
Yes, as artists, we definitely,
yes.
we appreciate the opportunity, so thanks.
So, thank you all. I want to thank all of you for joining me today, and especially my friend Mark Rossier for the interview. I hope you all enjoyed it, and have a good day. Take care.